Hi guys, in this video we will be learning about global governance, looking at the roles of the UN and the World Trade Organization, finishing with an exam-style question.
To start, we're going to be looking at global governance and defining what global governance is. So global governance can be defined as a movement of political integration aimed at negotiating responses to problems that affect more than one state or region. So it's essentially between countries. And it typically refers to the ways in which global affairs, which typically affect the whole world, are managed. So often there'll be global affairs which don't affect one particular country, so they can't be governed by one national government. For things, for example, like climate change, they are managed on a global level, and this is essentially what global governance is. Because there is no global government that manages the world, it's essentially countries coming together to govern certain global issues. So typically, cooperation is negotiated between countries, which then agreed to abide by similar rules given to them, and these are usually in international laws and in signed treaties. But as the world is becoming more independent through the process of globalization, global economic governance is really, really important, especially for achieving sustainable development across all nations. And this is especially true for the governance of the global commons, which we will look at in a following video, which are essentially resource domains that are outside political reach, such as the Antarctic, outer space, and the high seas. There's 4 global commons, but we'll look at this in another video in more detail. And essentially, they are areas beyond political reach, so they need to be governed on a global level by everyone essentially, because there's no particular state or organisation that is responsible for them. So that is essentially why global governance is so important. So now that we've looked at what global governance is, we're now going to look at regulating global systems. And in this increasingly economically integrated world, through the process of globalization, some governments arguing that they're losing their influence, and now companies and organizations such as transnational corporations, which we learned about in previous videos, now have even more power and control over resources and capital and labor and so on, more than typical national governments have now. So now we're going to look at the international issues which global governance has focused on, and this is typically in response to the acceleration of globalization, and typically global governance is used as a term to describe the process which is about designing laws and rules and regulations to manage the global system. So, for example, some international issues which global governance aims to regulate are things like reducing environmental problems, trade and investment inequities, reducing poverty, resolving human rights violations, resolving civil conflict, and also dealing with financial instability, such as things like financial crises, such as the 2008 financial crisis. So moving on now, we're going to look at the organisations that are responsible for global governance. So these aren't national governments, these are typically organisations that are not linked to governments at all, but countries can be members of these organisations. So these organisations take responsibility for things like promoting growth, stability and development of all regions, and this is all done sustainably. So sustainability is a really key feature in global governance. So many of these organisations, as I mentioned before, have to be created because there are no world governments. So these organisations come together to form an overall ruling, especially when some countries won't agree with each other on certain issues. These organisations come in as an overruling power and will make a justified decision to essentially resolve issues. So the most kind of prominent organisation is the United Nations. And the United Nations tends to play an advisory role in global governments, and it tends to foster cooperation between state governments. As I mentioned before, if 2 state governments are disputing over an issue, the UN will come in and play an advisory role and essentially suggest which is the best option or way to go with a particular issue. So many organisations are then connected to the United Nations, such as United Nations Development Programme, which focuses on global development as a form of global governance, and we're going to look at UNDP in greater detail later on. And some other examples of international development agencies that we're going to look at in greater detail are the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization. Also, there are a number of different non-governmental organisations who have varying objectives, and they generally either ensure justice and equality for people of the world, and they also do things like campaigning for environmental sustainability, and they also are very anti-TNCs and corporations and so on. They try and challenge the negative impacts that TNCs are causing. So essentially, I've just given you an overview to some of the international development agencies that we have who act or perform the role of global governance. So now I'm going to look at some of these organisations in greater detail from now on in the video. So the first international development agency we're going to look at in greater detail is the United Nations Development Programme. This is their logo here, and as you can see, their catchline is Empowered Lives, Resilient Nation. So the aims of the UNDP are to eradicate poverty, reduce inequalities such as things like healthcare inequalities and education and gender inequality and so on, and also the reduction of exclusion. So the UNDP operate in over 170 countries, and in 2000 they created what were called the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, and these were a set of anti-poverty targets. There were 8 of them, and the member countries were committed to achieve them by 2015. But as things turned out, by 2015, a lot of these issues had not been resolved. So post-2015, there was the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are still being formed, and there are 17 of these goals, and they relate to development, disaster risk reduction, climate change, and global sustainable development. So these are the goals for the next 15 years from 2015 to 2030. So I'm going to look at these a bit now to give you an idea of what these sorts of goals are. So here are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They include the eradication of poverty, no hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. So as you can see, these are goals to transform the world. Essentially, that's what the UN Development Programme are trying to achieve by 2030. And I'm sure we'll find that by 2030, a lot of these 17 issues will not be fully resolved, and then they'll create another set of goals for the next 15 years. But the point is, developing these goals is that they're meant to be sustainable, which means that they're trying not to use up resources and create the world a better place for future generations to live. So to prevent overexploitation of resources and so on, and help the world develop sustainably, especially those less developed countries at the moment. So the next organisation we're going to look at is the World Trade Organization, and this is their logo here. And as a response to globalization, the World Trade Organization's focus is on the issues of trade and investment inequities. So typically, injustice has been partially alleviated through the process of globalization, but it's undoubtedly been accentuated in other ways. So the World Trade Organization's commitments are to liberalizing trade, which means making trade more free. And we learned about free trade in a previous video. And this is allowing all countries to trade with each other on a free term basis. So to remove trade barriers and tariffs and so on, to make it easier for trade to occur. So therefore, they're also responsible for combating exploitative practices used by some countries and transnational corporations. And they're also aiming to remove protectionist policies by some, which have been adopted by some governments and trading blocs, which are to protect their own regions, but act as a sort of potential damage to other regions. The next organisation we're going to look at is the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And there was initially an Earth Summit. Its name was the Earth Summit, and this took place in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And it was important in setting out Agenda 21, which was a voluntary action plan which was agreed by many governments, and its aims were to develop strategies for long-term sustainable development. And 10 years after the Earth Summit in Rio in 2002, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which is what we're focusing on now, which was brought together in Johannesburg in South Africa in 2002, and this brought together thousands of participants, and it focused on the world's attention on meeting difficult challenges. And these involved things like improving people's lives, also through things like improving sanitation, access to clean water, energy, and health. So that was what the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002 was mainly focusing its attentions on. And further conferences have been held by the UN involving government leaders at the highest level to deal with these sorts of issues, and there tends to be another summit every 10 years or so, such as the next summit was in 2012 and the next one will be in 2022. And the summit held in 2012 was the Rio +20 summit, obviously because it was 20 years after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And these summits were held to reinvigorate global commitment to sustainable development, which was the original goals of the Earth Summit in 1992, to assess the progress on these sustainable development goals, and also to advance international cooperation on sustainable development. So essentially, the Rio +20 summit was essentially kind of recapping the Agenda 21, which was set out in 1992, and reviewing how these goals were being achieved and the prospects of reaching these targets. So, as I mentioned before, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which happens every 10 years, its goals are typically to improve people's lives and conserve natural resources, and to deal with the strains on sustainability such as health, energy, sanitation, shelter, water, food, and growing populations. So it tackles all these issues in order to achieve sustainable development. So just to recap on Rio +20, which occurred in 2012, its aims was to reinvigorate global commitment to sustainable development, advance international cooperation on sustainable development, as well as assessing progress on sustainable development and targets. So we don't really need to know about these summits in detail, but it's good to understand which summit was focusing on which issues. So it's good to know that the World Summit on Sustainable Development is focusing specifically on sustainable development and how that can be achieved. The United Nations Environment Programme, or UNEP, are the body responsible for supporting a coherent structure of international environmental governance. And UNEP has been the leading global environmental authority since 1972, and it has also grown in status alongside increasing concern about human impact on the global environment. So overall, the UNEP's mission statement is to provide things like leadership and encourage partnership between countries in caring for the environment, and essentially inspiring sustainability in environmental terms, so as to improve people's lives and improve development sustainably so that it doesn't impact the quality of the environment for future generations. And the work of the UNEP works along the Sustainable Development Goals, which we learned about in the previous video. So it's very much tied into sustainability and allowing development to occur without damaging the environment. Finally, the last international development agency we're going to look at is related to the World Summit on Climate Change. And the body responsible for this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And earlier on in the previous video, I mentioned that the atmosphere was one of the global commons, which is an area or resource which is not governed by one specific nation state, therefore it's governed by global governance. So the atmosphere is really key to climate change, as it's outside the political reach of any one nation state, but it's also where we have the effect of increased carbon dioxide emissions and so on, and increasing global temperatures. So the atmosphere plays a key role in climate change, which is something we're trying to prevent at the moment. So we require this intergovernmental panel on the Convention of Climate Change, essentially, to be able to provide governance over the atmosphere so that countries don't go and pollute the atmosphere excessively, and so on. So essentially, the UNFCCC are responsible for overseeing negotiations on reducing greenhouse gas emissions between nation states. So they provide a framework and set limits on the amount that a specific country can emit greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, and these greenhouse gases are what are causing global warming and climate change. And at the UN Paris Climate Summit in 2015, a deal was struck by the most powerful world leaders, which will come into force in 2020. It's a legally binding deal, and it's essentially is agreed to hold global temperature rises to a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and this is in the aim to avert the worst effects of global warming. So this is what they've decided, that they will limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and they will aim for that through the reduction of greenhouse gases from individual countries. So the key features of this deal made at the UN Paris Climate Summit in 2015 was that all countries will voluntarily cut their emissions. There will be a long-term aim to reduce net emissions to zero in the second half of the 21st century. Alongside this, the wealthy countries will pledge $1,000 billion a year to help developing countries adapt to the specific requirements of cutting emissions. And this is because a lot of the time in developing countries, they don't have the same technologies that richer countries do, which are less polluting. So they're still using more polluting forms of technology. So the richer countries are going to have decided that they're going to help the developing countries to reduce their emissions by pledging this money to them. Also, they're going to review a mechanism to increase pledges every 5 years to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And also, there's going to be a loss and damage mechanism installed, which is going to address the losses that vulnerable countries will face from climate change. For example, sea level rise, which is a big impact of climate change. So they're going to help install this mechanism to help those poorest countries who will lose a lot from sea level change. Finally, we're going to look a bit about non-governmental organisations, otherwise known as NGOs, as they're commonly referred to. And NGOs are part of the globalisation process, and they have expanded their scope because of globalisation from local and national settings and have increasingly become international organisations that are not linked to governments. That's why they're called non-governmental organisations. So they operate outside of nation states. And in the 21st century, NGOs have essentially developed as a global force to democratise decision-making, for example, persuading governments to consider bottom-up approaches through helping the poorest people rather than funding big government projects in less developed countries. They also advocate to protect human rights and also provide essential services to the most needy people in the world in the least developed countries. And typically, NGOs are funded by charitable donations, and some of them are also given money by governments. And there are two different types of NGOs. They are called advocacy NGOs and operational NGOs. And both of these types are funded by donations and government donations as well. But there is this distinct difference between the two. So operational NGOs provide frontline support services to the neediest people on Earth. And an example of an operational NGO is Oxfam, who you might have heard of, and they tend to raise money for each project that they undertake. And the other type of NGO we have is an advocacy NGO. And advocacy NGOs are those who focus on campaigns to raise awareness and gain support for specific causes, and they derive their money from donations and so on. An example is raising awareness for diseases like HIV and malaria. And another common example is a group called Friends of the Earth, and they are an environmental NGO to raise education on the issues of climate change and other environmental issues. And finally, just to finish off, it's important to note that NGOs are now becoming more and more important in supporting development, and they are often the only coordinated organisations for providing a voice to the poorest people of the world. That's really essential. Often governments don't really listen to or take the voices of the poor and listen to what they have to say. So NGOs try and change this, and they listen to the poorest people and take example for what the poorest people might have to say, because often they might have some really valuable suggestions about how things could be done better. And an example of an NGO that operates in this way is Amnesty International, and they tend to focus on global issues, and they don't tie themselves to the interests of any government at all. They simply focus on the needs of the people and try to improve them. So now we're going to answer an exam-style question which asks us to outline the concept of global governance and explain the role of one international development agency of your choice for 7 marks. So the first thing we're going to do in this question to answer it is define global governance, because that's the first half of the question. So you can almost divide the question in two. So we're going to divide this into 2 paragraphs. So this is one part of the question, and the second half will be about explaining the role of an international development agency. So for this first half of the question, we're going to define the concept of global governance. And what's really good to do when you're revising is just to make a list of definitions and learn them off by heart. So here I've written, global governance refers to the ways in which global affairs are affecting the whole world are managed. Therefore, it is a movement of political integration aimed at negotiating responses to problems affecting more than one country. So that's essentially the main definition of global governance here. And then what's good is always to go into a bit more extra detail about global governance and what it is and what it does. So therefore I've written, cooperation is typically negotiated between countries which agree to abide by similar rules given in international laws. And then I've gone to give on some examples to finish off the paragraph on global governance. So I've said in recent years, global governance has focused on international issues such as human rights violations, environmental problems, and poverty reduction. So that's that one chunk of the question completely answered. And then we'll move on to the next part. So the next part of the question asks us to explain the role of one specific international development agency, and it's your choice which one you want to do. For the sake of this question, I've chosen the United Nations Development Programme, and essentially we want to state the role of the UNDP here and just give a little bit more extra information in the work that they're involved in and so on. Don't need to go into too much detail, but briefly give a broad outline of the work that they do and the role that they have in global governance. So I've written that the United Nations Development Programme, or the UNDP, another quick point here is if you've got a really long word or the name of a company or an organisation, you can put the abbreviation in brackets, and then you can use this abbreviated version later on when you're writing just to save you space. So I said the UNDP is an international development agency. That's essentially what it is. Its aims are to eradicate poverty across the world and reduce inequalities and exclusion. So that's the aim of the UNDP. Good, stated, and that's all you need. And therefore, we're going to go on to the type of work that they actually do and who's involved in this work. So then I've said the UNDP is therefore a form of global governance as it operates in over 170 countries. The UNDP created a set of anti-poverty goals in 2000 called the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. And they are now in the process of defining Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, for the next 15 years. And then I've gone to give a bit more detail about the SDGs because this is the main work that the UNDP does. So I've said the SDGs focus on development, disaster risk reduction, climate change, and global sustainable development. So that is that question answered. We've answered what is global governance and then given an example of an agency that operates to provide global governance.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're looking for an amazing A-level geography resource, join me today in my series of engaging bite-sized video tutorials. See you soon, and together let's make A-level geography a walk in the park.